The notice was taped to my apartment door with 3 strips of blue painter's tape, as if whoever had put it there wanted to be sure the bad news stayed flat. I read it twice before I unlocked the door. 30 days. The building had been sold. The new owners planned a full renovation, and every tenant had to leave by the end of October. A cheerful final sentence thanked us for making the building part of the neighborhood. One signature and one notice had turned the place where I had slept for 4 years into a future luxury rental, with no room for me. Inside, I did what I always did when something went wrong. I made a list, call the property manager, check listings, measure the bookshelves, and ask the museum whether I could store boxes in the fabrication shop. I did not call Mason. Mason would have answered on the first ring, driven over with packing tape, and treated the problem like a fallen branch blocking a road. He was good at removing obstacles. I was good at making sure I never became one. By 9 that night, I had bookmarked 11 apartments I could not afford, and convinced myself that sleeping in my car for a week would count as flexibility rather than failure. Mason called at 9:14. I watched his name flash on the screen until the phone stopped vibrating. A second later, he texted, "You alive?" I wrote, "Busy. Long day." He replied with a photograph of a city maple split by wind, one half resting across a parked sedan. This tree also said it was busy. Then came another message, "Dinner tomorrow?" I typed maybe and put the phone face down. 5 minutes later, someone knocked hard enough to rattle the chain. Mason stood in the hallway, wearing his rain-dark work jacket, damp hair pushed back, and the expression he usually reserved for contractors who planted the wrong species under power lines. "You ignored one call and answered a direct question with maybe," he said. "That's Elliot, for something is on fire." I stepped aside. He saw the notice on the counter before I could hide it. He read it while I filled the kettle, then folded the paper carefully along its existing crease. "How long have you known?" 4 hours. "And your plan was to tell me when?" "After I had a plan." Mason leaned against the counter, arms folded. Most people mistook his quietness for calm. I knew the difference. Calm Mason blinked slowly. Angry Mason went very still. "You're moving into my spare room," he said. I laughed because the alternative was letting the offer reach somewhere tender. "No. You need somewhere to stay." "I have somewhere." "You're selling the house." "Exactly. It's mostly empty. I'm fixing it up anyway, and the spare room is currently occupied by a lamp with no shade." I poured water over 2 tea bags, buying time. The house had belonged to his Aunt Ruth, who had died the previous winter. Mason had spent months repairing it before the sale. After that, he planned to take a municipal arborist position in Denver. In 6 weeks, maybe 8, both he and the house would belong to different futures. "I don't want to get in the way," I said. "Of what?" "Open houses, repairs, your life." My life currently includes eating cereal over the sink and arguing with a realtor about beige. He accepted the mug, but did not drink. 6 weeks. No rent. You help me paint, and I won't mention the time you tried to hang a shelf using double-sided tape. It was industrial mounting tape. The shelf fell on you. The tape remained committed. He smiled then, brief and crooked. It was the smile that had gotten me through funerals, breakups, and one terrible Christmas when my flight was canceled, and he drove 3 hours through sleet to pick me up. I had loved him for longer than I admitted even to myself. Not dramatically, not with hope. Loving Mason had become more like knowing where north was. Useful, permanent, and not something I expected to reach. I agreed the next morning, after 3 landlords failed to return my calls, and one listing turned out to be a converted laundry room with a hot plate. Mason sent me a photograph of the spare room before I could change my mind. Problem solved. 6 weeks. No rent. You can complain about the wallpaper after you move in. The wallpaper was covered in tiny brown sailboats. I replied that the room appeared to have been decorated for a seasick child. He wrote, "So you'll feel at home." By Saturday, my life had been divided into boxes labeled books, clothes, work, kitchen, and miscellaneous, where I put anything that felt too personal to name. Mason arrived with his truck and breakfast sandwiches, then carried most of the heavy boxes before I could argue. At the house, he had cleared the spare room, replaced the loose window latch, and left folded dark blue sheets on the bed. There was space in the closet. An empty hook waited behind the door. On the dresser sat the phone charger I had left in his truck 2 months earlier. None of it was romantic. That was the danger. Mason's care had always arrived disguised as preparation, which made it easy to accept and difficult not to want more of. I unpacked enough to make the room functional. Shirts in the closet, books on the small shelf, toiletries in the bathroom cabinet Mason had emptied for me. One box stayed sealed. It held framed photographs, 2 of my father's books, a chipped wooden bird I had made when I was 9, and other objects I rarely displayed. In every apartment I had rented, that box had remained under the bed. Putting those things out made a place feel permanent, and permanence had always seemed like a promise made by people who had not yet changed their minds. Mason noticed me pushing it beneath the frame. "You forget one? It's the box I never need." He looked as if he wanted to ask what that meant, but only nodded. "Dining room. I need your alleged design expertise." The dining room wall held 5 uneven rectangles of neutral paint. Mason handed me a brush and opened a sample labeled Harbor Gray. "The realtor says cool colors make rooms look larger." The same realtor called this house a transitional opportunity. It's transitioning from mine to someone willing to pay too much for it. We painted a square beside the others. Mason's sleeve brushed mine twice. The second time, neither of us moved immediately. I concentrated on smoothing the lower edge, while the smell of fresh paint filled the room. When we finished, I took a pencil from my pocket and wrote Harbor Gray, October 3rd beneath the patch. Mason glanced at the date. "Planning to leave evidence?" Future owners deserve to know how many versions of gray you considered before surrendering to beige. That evening, we ate Thai food on the dining room floor because the table had already been staged elsewhere. Mason said Denver wanted an answer by November. I told him the Science Museum had approved my new deep-sea exhibit. We spoke easily about everything coming next, as long as we did not acknowledge that our nexts pointed in different directions. Before bed, I thanked him again. He waved it away and told me not to use all the hot water. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a cabinet closing in the kitchen. Mason stood at the sink in a t-shirt and sweatpants, drinking water in the dark, while rain ticked against the windows. "Are you all right?" I asked. He stared toward the dining room. The house sounds different at night, since Ruth died. There was nothing useful to say, so I stayed beside him until he finished the glass. Then I returned to the spare room and closed the door most of the way. A few minutes later, the floor creaked on his side of the wall. "That's better," Mason said quietly. I lay awake longer than I should have, listening to the rain and wondering whether he meant the silence, the house, or the fact that I was there. By the 3rd morning, Mason had stopped asking whether I wanted breakfast and started leaving a second plate beside the stove. He called it efficiency. I called it suspicious, because the eggs were cooked the way I liked them, firm at the edges and soft in the middle. He had also moved his work boots from the mat by the front door, leaving space for mine, and cleared half a shelf in the bathroom cabinet without comment. Each change was small enough to dismiss. Together, they made the house feel as though it had been expecting me. I kept reminding myself that it was temporary, 6 weeks, maybe less, if I found an apartment quickly. Still, I began learning the sounds of Mason's mornings, the kettle clicking off, the scrape of a chair, the low curse when his weather app lied about the rain. Our schedules overlapped in strange pockets. Mason often returned before me and texted to ask whether I had eaten, then pretended the question was about grocery planning. On Wednesday, I came home to find a narrow work table assembled beneath the spare room window. It was exactly the right height for sketching exhibit plans. "You built this?" Mason shrugged and tightened one last screw. "You were using a moving box as a desk. Many important ideas have begun on cardboard." That one was labeled kitchen appliances. I ran my palm over the smooth wood. He had rounded the front edge because I always leaned against my desks while drawing. I did not ask how he remembered. Before the next open house, Mason took me to the hardware store and tossed me the better of his 2 rain jackets. "Mine has a hood," I said. Yours has a decorative flap pretending to be a hood. We argued about it all the way to the truck. At the store, I followed Mason through the aisles and criticized his paint choices. A clerk helped us load trim boards onto the cart and asked how long we had been renovating together. Mason answered too fast. We're not together. The clerk blinked. Mason added, the renovation. He's just staying at the house. That explanation somehow made the silence worse. I studied a display of cabinet handles while heat climbed into my face. The clerk recovered first and asked whether we wanted the boards cut. Outside, Mason opened the truck bed and said, I made that weird. You transformed an ordinary misunderstanding into a sworn statement before Congress. I didn't want him thinking. He stopped. Thinking what? Mason secured the strap harder than necessary. That you were responsible for my paint choices. The joke did not erase the moment. Mason had never minded strangers assuming we were a couple before, but renovating a house together sounded more domestic, and perhaps he needed the distinction clear. When we pulled into the driveway, he rested both hands on the steering wheel. I'm glad you're here, he said. The sentence landed without context. Before I could answer, he climbed out into the rain. We spent the afternoon replacing trim in the upstairs hallway. Mason measured. I marked the cuts. He held each board in place while I checked the angle, close enough that his shoulder pressed against mine. Familiarity should have made the contact meaningless. Instead, I noticed the warmth through his shirt. When I looked up, I found him watching my mouth. His gaze moved immediately to the pencil behind my ear. You have sawdust on your face, he said. He reached toward me, stopped, and handed me an old towel. I wiped my cheek. Better? Mason looked for one beat too long. Yeah. For the first open house, the realtor hid every sign that the spare room was occupied and sent me away with my laptop. At a cafe near the museum, I tried not to picture strangers opening Mason's closets and discussing where their furniture might go. It should not have bothered me. The house was not mine. Yet I kept picturing someone painting over Harbor Gray before the pencil date had fully dried. Mason called 40 minutes before the open house ended. Where are you? At the place you told me to go. There was a pause. Voices echoed behind him. Right. Are you coming back after? I assumed you'd be busy with the realtor. She can tell me how many people hated the kitchen without supervision. I thought we could order dinner. You miss me already? I asked. Mason exhaled something between a laugh and a warning. I need someone here who knows the decorative pillows are hostile. When I returned, the staged pillows had been piled in a chair. Mason stood in the kitchen opening takeout containers. He had ordered my usual without asking. The realtor had reported 3 interested buyers and 1 couple requesting a second viewing. That's good, I said. Mason looked toward the dining room instead of answering. We ate at the counter because strangers had tracked damp leaves across the floor. I told him about Adrian Cole, an architect who had spent most of Friday disagreeing with me about how much darkness children would tolerate in the deep-sea gallery. He asked me to dinner, I said. Mason's chopstick stopped halfway to his mouth. Is that a date? He used the word dinner, which is generally how dates disguise themselves before appetizers. Mason resumed eating. He sounds annoying. You've heard one sentence about him. He disagreed with you about the exhibit. You disagree with me every Sunday about paint. That's different. I waited for an explanation. He took a drink of water. I'm right, he said. His tone was casual, but the muscles along his jaw had tightened. I shut down the small current of hope. Mason considered skepticism part of friendship. After dinner, we opened the sample of warm linen. Mason said it looked like oatmeal. I said that was still more appealing than Harbor Gray, which resembled a parking garage during a storm. We painted a new rectangle beside the first. Our shoulders bumped. Neither of us apologized. When I leaned back to compare the colors, Mason said, "You're actually going out with him?" I wrote warm linen, October 10th beneath the swatch. Probably. Mason crouched beside me and studied the pencil marks as if the date contained information he had missed. You don't even like architects. I work with architects constantly. Exactly. I laughed, but Mason did not. The realtor called the next afternoon. The interested couple wanted a private second viewing on Thursday at 7. That was the same evening Adrian had suggested for dinner. I offered to reschedule, but Mason said the viewing had nothing to do with me. Go, he told me. I can handle 2 people looking at a staircase. His voice was so even that I almost believed him. I confirmed the date with Adrian. On Thursday, Mason repaired a perfectly functional cabinet hinge, while I tried on 2 shirts and rejected both. When I came down in the third, he looked up, then away. That one's fine, he said. I reached for my coat. Mason closed the cabinet slowly. How serious is this Adrian thing? The question held me in the doorway. It's one dinner, not a joint mortgage. I know, he wiped his hands on a cloth that was already clean. The doorbell rang before he said anything else. Through the glass, I could see the realtor standing beside the couple who might soon own the house. Mason looked from them to me, as if both arrivals had happened too early. The woman outside pointed toward the enclosed porch and smiled, already imagining it as hers. Mason opened the door, but his attention remained on me. Don't be late, he said quietly. Mason spent the 20 minutes before I left, tightening the same cabinet hinge 3 different times. Each time I passed through the kitchen, he had another tool in his hand and the same line between his eyebrows. I changed shirts twice upstairs, which I blamed on the weather, even though it had been raining steadily for 6 days. When I came down in a dark green button-up, Mason looked at me from the collar to the cuffs. Too formal, he said. You told me the blue one looked like I was interviewing for a mortgage. This one looks like you already have one. I put on my coat. You understand this is dinner, not a hostage negotiation. Depends on the architect. The couple entered as I was leaving. They were friendly and efficient, the kind of people who could discuss removing a load-bearing wall without raising their voices. The woman complimented the porch. Her husband asked whether the built-in shelves in the dining room were original. Mason said they were. The man tapped one and told the realtor they would probably tear them out to open the space. Mason's expression barely changed, but his fingers closed around the tape measure in his hand. I paused at the door. Have fun imagining the destruction of your childhood. The buyers laughed. Mason did not. He looked at my coat, then at the rain. Text me when you get there. Adrian chose a small restaurant near the waterfront. He was handsome, thoughtful, and willing to admit I had been right about the deep-sea exhibit lighting. It was a good date. That was the problem. I spent most of it wondering whether Mason had stopped the buyers from measuring the built-ins for demolition. Halfway through dessert, Adrian set down his spoon. Can I ask you something slightly rude? Rude questions are usually more interesting. Are you actually available? I laughed once, but he did not. He said I had checked my phone every time it lit up. Then he asked whether there was someone else. No, I said automatically. My phone buzzed again beside my plate. Mason had sent a photograph of the cabinet hinge with the message, "Survived. Barely." Adrian glanced at the screen before I turned it over. That him? Mason is my best friend. Adrian nodded with the patient expression of a man who had just been given an answer he did not believe. Then, somebody should probably tell your face. The date ended kindly. When I reached the house, a lamp waited in the living room, and Mason sat at the kitchen table with 2 beers open, though he had barely touched his. You're early, he said. You told me not to be late. That's not the same thing. He pushed the second bottle toward me. I asked how the viewing went. Mason said the couple loved the location, the porch, and the possibility of destroying everything recognizable. They're buyers, I said. They're allowed to imagine changes. They can imagine them somewhere else. I sat across from him. How protective are you planning to get over a house you're selling? Mason rolled the bottle between his palms. I don't know. It was an unusually honest answer. Are you having second thoughts? He shook his head too quickly and asked about Adrian instead. Smart, polite, probably never uses the wrong anchor for drywall. Sounds perfect. You hate him. I don't know him. That has never stopped you. His mouth moved, as if he might smile, but the expression disappeared. Did you have a good time? He asked. Yes. Mason looked down at the beer. Then why are you home? The question exposed more than either of us expected. I could have lied. Instead, I said, Because I kept thinking about whether you were all right. Mason went still. Rain tapped the kitchen window behind him. I was fine. You sent me a photograph of a hinge. It was a difficult evening. I laughed, and some tension loosened. Then Mason asked why I had never told him I wanted something permanent. I knew he was no longer talking about Adrian. What would I have told you? I asked. That I want the kind of relationship where my toothbrush isn't waiting to be packed. That I'm tired of knowing exactly how much of myself fits into a moving box. Mason's gaze lifted. You could have told me. Wanting permanence doesn't create it. He absorbed that in silence. I could almost see him searching for a practical response, some shelf he could clear, or lock he could replace. Instead, he asked, do you feel temporary here? The truthful answer was dangerous. My shoes were by the door, my mug beside Mason's, and my sketches on the table, but the sale sign remained in the yard, and Denver remained on his phone. I am temporary here, I said. Mason flinched as if I had corrected him in front of someone. He stood, collected both bottles, and said he had an early inspection. At the stairs, he looked back. You don't have to leave just because the calendar says 6 weeks. What other date should I use? He had no answer. 2 days later, Mason asked me to meet him at a city park where he was assessing a damaged big-leaf maple. He spoke more openly beneath branches than inside rooms. Most people see a scar and assume the whole thing is unsafe, he said. How can you tell? You look at what's still holding. He glanced at me instead of the tree. If the roots are sound, visible damage isn't always a reason to cut something down. Sunday brought another paint sample. October rain looked blue in the can and gray on the wall, which Mason said was appropriate for Tacoma because the city could not commit to either. We worked without music. The silence had changed since my date. Mason painted the upper edge while I filled the center. I didn't like you going out with him, he said. My brush stopped. He kept his eyes on the wall. Adrian? Unless there was another architect. Why? Mason added paint to a section that did not need it. I don't know. That answer is becoming a habit. His jaw tightened. I didn't like waiting here while you were with him. I set my brush across the tray. Would you dislike anyone dating me? Mason finally looked at me. There were several safe answers available. He chose none. Maybe. What does that mean? It means I'm trying not to say something before I understand it. The room seemed smaller. Mason crouched to reach the lower corner as I reached for the roller. Our hands met over the tray. Paint touched his thumb. Neither of us moved. I felt the roughness of his knuckles against my fingers and the restraint in the way he held still. His eyes dropped to my mouth, then returned to mine. Elliot, he said, quietly enough that my name sounded unfinished. The realtor's call broke the moment. Mason pulled his hand away and answered with paint still on his skin. I cleaned the roller while he listened. The interested couple had made an offer, strong enough that the realtor's excitement carried across the room. Mason asked for the details, then walked into the hallway. I wrote October rain, October 17th beneath the new swatch, though my hand was less steady than before. A minute later, I heard him say, "No, not this one." The realtor spoke rapidly. Mason repeated himself. When he returned, I asked what had been wrong with the offer. He stared at the paint wall instead of me. They weren't right for the house. I looked at the built-in shelves, the drying colors, and the man who had planned for months to leave all of it behind. For the first time, Mason did not sound like someone trying to sell a house. He sounded like someone protecting a life he had not yet admitted he wanted. Mason avoided discussing the rejected offer for 3 days. He answered every practical question I asked about the house, but whenever I returned to the buyers, he found something else to inspect. The foundation, the gutters, a hairline crack above the pantry door that had probably existed since 1987. By Wednesday, I stopped asking, not because I believed him, but because I understood the shape of his silence. Mason would rather repair an entire house than admit one thing inside him had shifted. The 6-week deadline was close enough to appear on every calendar I opened. I had toured 3 apartments, rejected 2, and kept thinking about the third. It was smaller than my old place, but the windows faced east. The rent was possible if I stopped ordering lunch. and the property manager had said I could move in before November. I saved the brochure in my work bag and scheduled a second viewing for Friday afternoon. I did not tell Mason. The omission felt dishonest, but telling him felt worse. Every time I pictured saying, "I may have found somewhere," I imagined the way his face had changed when I called myself temporary. He found out anyway. I was standing at the kitchen counter on Thursday evening, answering an email from the museum, when my phone lit up beside him. Second apartment viewing, Friday, 4:30. Mason looked at the screen before I could turn it over. He did not say anything for several seconds. Then he placed the knife he was using beside the cutting board with deliberate care. "You found an apartment." "I found one to look at again." "You weren't going to mention it?" "I just did." "No, your phone did." His voice was quiet, which meant he was angrier than if he had raised it. "Finding somewhere else was always the plan," I said. "The house is still listed. Denver is still waiting for an answer. I'm not doing anything unexpected." "I thought we had more time." The sentence stopped me. More time for what? Mason looked toward the dining room, where 3 paint rectangles waited on the wall like unfinished arguments. "Before you had to decide. I'm not the one who created the deadline. You don't have to leave at 6 weeks." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." "Then what is true after that?" He opened his mouth, but I continued before he could offer another temporary arrangement. "You sell the house. You move to Denver. I find somewhere else. That is the plan you explained, before I brought in the first box. Plans can change. Yours or mine." The question landed between us. Mason turned back to the cutting board, though he no longer seemed to know what he was making. I hated that part of me wanted him to say mine, not the house, not Denver, me. Instead, he picked up the knife and said dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. A storm moved in that night, loud enough to wake me before dawn. Rain struck the windows in sheets, and wind pushed against the old house until the porch boards groaned. At 6, I found Mason in the dining room staring at a dark stain spreading across the ceiling. "That seems bad," I said. "It's not ideal." Water dropped onto the floor between us. We moved furniture, set down buckets, and climbed into the attic with flashlights. Mason covered a section where the wind had lifted the roofing near the chimney. By the time we climbed down, both of us were damp and filthy. Flooding closed the museum, and Mason's supervisor told him to wait out the wind. We stayed home. Without the realtor's staging, the dining room looked exhausted. Towels covered the floor. Buckets collected the last slow drips. Mason sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, his wet shirt clinging to his shoulders. I handed him a mug of coffee and sat beside him. "You know, most buyers prefer ceilings that remain above them. They're demanding. You could add indoor water feature to the listing." He laughed, tired and genuine. For a few minutes, the house was only a problem we had solved together. Then the quiet returned. Mason rubbed both hands over his face. "I've started measuring my days by when you come home." I turned toward him. He stared into his coffee. "I know what time you usually walk through the door. I know if you're late without checking the clock. I know which evenings you'll complain about the museum and which ones you'll pretend everything was fine, until I ask twice." The air seemed to tighten around us. "What does that mean?" I asked. "I don't know yet." I looked away before disappointment could show too clearly. "You keep asking me to live inside your uncertainty. That's not what I'm trying to do." "Then what are you trying to do?" Mason set the mug on the floor. "Figure out why the idea of you moving into another apartment feels worse than selling this house." I could have admitted that every ordinary evening, there resembled the life I wanted. But I had spent too long translating Mason's actions into promises he had never made. "I can't interpret this for you," I said, "and I can't be the person you keep close while you decide whether wanting me is real." His expression changed. "I know." "Do you?" "Yes." Rain moved across the roof in one heavy wave. Mason turned toward me fully, his knee touching mine. "What would you want the answer to be?" he asked. The question was almost cruel, because he did not mean it cruelly. I looked at his face, at the worry beneath his steadiness, at the man who had made room for me everywhere, except inside a clear sentence. I'd want an answer you understood before you gave it to me. Mason's eyes lowered to my mouth. He moved closer, slowly enough that I could have stepped away. I did not. His hand came to rest on the floor beside mine, not touching, but near enough that I felt the heat of it. For one suspended second, I thought he was going to kiss me. Then he stopped. I can't make you the experiment I used to figure myself out, he said. The restraint hurt more than rejection. It was responsible, but whatever existed between us still had no shape I could trust. You're right, I said. I stood and carried both mugs to the sink. Behind me, Mason remained on the floor. Neither of us spoke about the distance that had opened. That Sunday, we painted Quiet Blue. The name sounded like something chosen by a person who believed sadness could be marketed. We worked in silence, careful not to touch. Mason painted the upper half of the rectangle. I filled the lower portion and wrote Quiet Blue, October 24th beneath it. The line of dated colors had begun to resemble a record of all the things we had nearly said. The realtor called while we were washing the brushes. Another offer had come in. Full price, flexible closing date. No demand that Mason repair the roof before the sale. Even from across the room, I could hear her telling him it was the strongest offer they were likely to receive. Mason asked for 48 hours. After he ended the call, I said, "What are you waiting for?" He looked at me. "I told you, I need time." "For the house?" His silence was answer enough. I went to the apartment viewing on Friday. The property manager showed me the storage closet, the laundry room, and the east-facing windows. I tried to imagine my books there, my coffee mug, the unopened box beneath another unfamiliar bed. The apartment was available, affordable, and entirely mine. I took the brochure home and left it on the dresser while I showered. When I came downstairs, Mason stood in the dining room holding it. He did not look angry this time. He looked hurt. "Were you ever going to tell me you found somewhere else?" I stopped beside the paint wall. "Were you ever going to ask me to stay?" Mason looked at Harbor Gray, warm linen, October rain, and Quiet Blue. 4 attempts to make the room ready for strangers. 4 Sundays of building something neither of us had named. His grip tightened around the brochure. But he still had no answer. The realtor called me the next morning because Mason was not answering. He had given her my number weeks earlier so I could coordinate access during open houses, but she had never contacted me about an offer before. I was in the museum workshop, standing beneath the half-built frame of a giant squid, when my phone rang. She apologized for bothering me, then asked whether Mason had decided how he wanted to proceed. "I'm not involved in the sale," I said. There was a pause long enough to make me step away from the table saw. "I thought he would have told you," she said. "Told me what?" "That he declined it." The workshop seemed to lose its sound. Around me, 2 technicians continued fitting translucent panels over the squid's metal ribs. Someone dropped a wrench. A ventilation fan hummed above the paint booth. "The full price offer?" "Yes, last night." I looked at the date on the wall calendar, though I already knew it. The 6 weeks Mason had given me ended in 9 days. The buyers had accepted the roof issue and offered a flexible closing date. Mason had refused without giving a clear reason and postponed his answer to Denver again. I thanked her and ended the call before she could hear the change in my breathing. For almost a week, Mason had asked me why I was looking for an apartment, while he quietly removed the reason I had to leave. He had not asked what I wanted. He had changed the conditions around me and waited for me to stay. I left work early. Mason's truck was in the driveway when I arrived. He stood on a ladder beside the porch, replacing a section of gutter that did not appear damaged. The sale sign remained in the yard, wet leaves gathered around its metal legs. "You rejected the offer," I said. Mason looked down at me. His face changed before he climbed from the ladder. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "I don't know. That seems to be your answer for everything." He set the drill on the porch railing. "Can we go inside?" "No. You keep making decisions inside that house and expecting me to discover them afterward." Rain had begun as a thin mist. Mason glanced toward the neighboring windows, then back at me. "I needed more time." "You had time. You had a full-price offer, a flexible closing date, and a job waiting in Denver. You rejected one and postponed the other. I haven't decided about Denver. You decided enough to stop moving forward. Mason stepped off the porch. Why are you angry that I'm not selling? Because you didn't tell me. I knew you'd react like this. Then you knew it mattered to me. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. I'm trying to figure this out. No, you're trying to keep everything exactly where it is until you figure it out. That's not fair. Isn't it? The mist thickened into rain, catching in his hair and along the shoulders of my coat. You asked me to stay longer, I said. You got angry when I looked at apartments. You rejected 2 offers. You delayed Denver. But you never once said what you wanted from me. Mason's composure broke at the edges. Every time the realtor calls, I picture you packing, he said. I picture someone else living here. I picture coming home and your shoes aren't by the door. Your things are gone from the bathroom. The light in the dining room is off because no one leaves it on when I'm late. That tells me you don't want an empty house. It tells you more than that. Then say more. Mason looked at me as if the words were somewhere behind my shoulder. I don't want things to change, he said. The answer exhausted something in me. Everything changes, Mason. I know. No, you know how to delay it. That's different. He reached toward me, then let his hand fall. You keep finding reasons I can't leave, I said. You still haven't given me one reason you want me to stay. His face tightened. I just told you. You told me what you're afraid of losing. What's the difference? The difference is whether you want me, or whether you want protection from being alone. That's not what this is. Then what is it? He opened his mouth. Nothing came. I nodded because I had expected the silence and still hated myself for hoping. I signed a lease, I said. Mason stared at me. It's short term. 3 months. I get the keys Monday. You signed it already? Yes. When? Yesterday. Before we talked? We have talked. Over and over. You keep giving me questions and calling them answers. He turned away and gripped the porch railing. Rain ran from the edge of the roof between us. You don't have to go, he said. I closed my eyes briefly. You're doing it again. What? Trying to solve this with a room. He faced me. Then pay rent. I almost laughed. If that's the problem, pay whatever you think is fair. Take the larger bedroom. Use the office. We can divide the utilities. I can put your name on. Stop. Mason did. You're offering me space, money, and terms. You are redesigning the arrangement because you still can't tell me what the relationship is. I'm trying to give you reasons to stay. No, you're giving me conditions that make leaving less convenient. He flinched. For 11 years, we had protected each other from grief, bad dates, and everything in between. We had never needed protection from each other. I love this house, I said. I love waking up and hearing you in the kitchen. I love that you know when I've had a bad day before I say anything. I love the stupid paint wall and the fact that you leave a light on for me. Mason's eyes lifted to mine. But I won't build a life out of hints, and I won't stay somewhere because you're afraid to watch me leave. The word love remained between us, incomplete but unmistakable. I went inside and began packing. Mason followed me upstairs, but stopped at the spare room door. I folded shirts into a suitcase and placed books back into boxes. He offered to help once. I said no. By evening, half the room looked the way it had before I arrived, and without my things in front of the sailboat wallpaper, it looked smaller. Downstairs, I removed my sketchbooks from the dining table. I collected my pencils from the windowsill and left the paint swatches untouched. Harbor gray, warm linen, October rain, quiet blue. Dates marking a month in which Mason and I had become almost everything except honest. I slept badly. The next morning, Mason left before sunrise. There was no second plate beside the stove. I told myself the absence was useful. It reminded me that the domestic life I had mistaken for permanence could disappear in a night. I spent Sunday carrying boxes to the front hall. That night, Mason moved through the house alone after I went upstairs. The floor creaked beneath his steps. The living room lamp clicked off, then on again. I lay awake and understood that he was hearing the house the way it had sounded before I came. In the morning, I found my unopened box downstairs beside the others. Anger rose before Mason entered the room. You moved this. I didn't open it. That wasn't the question. You almost left it under the bed. I knew where it was. He looked at the box, then at me. I didn't want you to forget something important. You don't know whether it's important. No, he said quietly. I don't. For once, he did not defend the decision. He crouched, lifted the box, and carried it back upstairs. He placed it exactly where it had been, and stepped away. I'm sorry, he said. I keep deciding where your things belong. The apology stopped me. Mason stood in the center of the nearly empty room. His face looked different, stripped of the certainty he wore through most of his life. I called the realtor, he said. I told her the rejected offers were my decisions. You had nothing to do with them. I waited. I declined Denver. My chest tightened, but I forced myself not to turn the action into meaning he had not stated. That was your decision. I know. You don't get to use it to make me responsible for what happens next. I know that too. Mason nodded toward the boxes. I'm not asking you to stay today. The words hurt, though they were the first responsible ones he had given me. What are you asking? One conversation, before you move everything. About what? About what I'm choosing. I studied him. Don't tell me what you stopped doing. Tell me what you're choosing. Mason glanced through the doorway toward the dining room and the wall of unfinished colors. This time, when he looked back at me, he did not search for a practical answer. All right, he said, I will. Mason asked me to meet him in the dining room that evening. By then, the rain had stopped. The windows reflected the warm interior of the house back at us, doubling the paint swatches on the wall. Harbor gray, warm linen, October rain, quiet blue. 4 versions of a room prepared for people who had never lived there. The table held only 2 glasses of water. Mason had understood that bringing documents or a spreadsheet would end the conversation before it began. I remained near the doorway. You said you wanted to tell me what you're choosing. I do. He looked nervous in a way I had rarely seen. None of the dangerous or difficult parts of his work had ever made his hands shake. He placed them flat against the table. I paused the listing, he said. I didn't cancel it permanently. I told the realtor I need to decide what I want to do with the house, whether you stay or not. I nodded. And Denver? I declined because I don't want that job anymore. I kept treating it like the next logical step because it paid more and gave me a reason to leave before this place could matter again. He glanced toward the ceiling. That was my decision. It isn't a sacrifice I expect you to repay. The words were careful, but they did not sound rehearsed. They sounded like someone crossing unstable ground and testing every step before trusting it. I've been trying to understand whether I'm afraid of losing the house, afraid of being alone, or afraid of losing you, he continued. The answer is that I'm afraid of all 3, but they aren't the same. I moved closer to the table, but did not sit. Mason looked directly at me. When Ruth died, I told myself selling this place would prove I was fine. I thought if I could clear out the rooms, repair everything, and hand the keys to someone else, then I would be done needing what this house had been for me. A safe place, I said. He nodded. Then you moved in, and it stopped feeling like something I had inherited. It became the place where you complained about my coffee, where your drawings covered the table, where someone knew whether I'd had a bad day before I decided to admit it. His voice tightened, but he did not look away. I thought I missed having someone here. That would have been easier. Loneliness has practical solutions. You get a roommate. You call more people. You stop eating dinner over the sink. I almost smiled. But I didn't miss noise when you were gone. I missed you. I didn't care whether there was a lamp on in the living room. I cared that you were the person who left it on for me. Something in my chest shifted, but I kept my hands at my sides. Mason stepped around the table, stopping several feet away. I rejected those offers because every one of them made your leaving real. I kept asking for time because I thought time would give me certainty without requiring honesty. Then I tried to make staying easier for you, as if enough space or lower rent could keep me from having to say what I wanted. What do you want? He inhaled slowly. I want to know what happened at the museum before you decide it isn't important enough to tell me. I want Sunday paint arguments. I want your shoes beside mine and your terrible labels on the leftovers. I want you to disagree with me when I'm pretending a practical answer is the same as an honest one. The distance between us felt deliberate now, a space he was leaving for my decision. I don't want you here because you need a room, he said. I want you here because every version of this house without you feels like somewhere I'm waiting to leave. The truth did not make anything simple. It made it real. What are you saying about us? I asked. That I love you. My breath caught despite every warning I had given myself. Mason continued, his voice quieter. I don't know yet what word I'll use for myself when people ask. Straight doesn't explain this. Maybe it never explained as much as I thought it did, but I know you aren't an exception I can hide inside. You aren't an experiment. You aren't a problem I'm trying to solve. The confession frightened me, almost as much as losing him. Once spoken, my love was no longer a safe, impossible thing I carried alone. Even after hearing that, I'm taking the apartment, I said. I know. For 3 months. Pain crossed his face, but he nodded. Okay. He waited. I need to know we can choose each other, without the house choosing for us. I don't want my feelings tied to whether I have somewhere else to sleep. That makes sense. And you need time to understand what this means for you. I do, but I don't need time to know whether I love you. There was no defensiveness in the answer, no attempt to pull me closer with urgency. I stepped around the table. I have loved you for years, I said. Mason closed his eyes briefly. I convinced myself it was manageable because I never expected anything from you. Then I moved in here, and you made space for me everywhere. I started mistaking that space for a promise. I should have made the promise clear. You couldn't make it before you understood it. No, but I could have stopped asking you to wait inside the confusion. We stood close enough that I could see the faint paint still caught near the edge of his thumbnail. I'm not promising this will be easy, I said. I'm not asking you to. I may get scared and start packing before there's anything to pack. Then I'll ask why. I won't move the boxes for you. That earned the laugh he had probably hoped for. Mason's gaze dropped to my mouth, then returned to my eyes. He did not move. Can I kiss you? He asked. The question was so simple that it undid the last of my resistance. I closed the distance myself. Yes. His hand came carefully to the side of my face. The kiss was warm and tentative, less like claiming something than confirming it existed. When I touched his waist, he exhaled and leaned closer. 11 years of familiarity changed shape between us, and I felt the moment he stopped fearing I would pull away. When we separated, his forehead rested lightly against mine. You're still moving Monday? He asked. Yes. Just checking. You're allowed to dislike it. I deeply dislike it. But I'll help. He did. On Monday morning, Mason carried boxes into my new apartment without trying to arrange them. He assembled the bed, checked the windows, and waited until I asked, before fixing a loose cabinet handle. Then he kissed me beside a stack-marked kitchen and drove back to the house alone. For the next 3 months, we dated deliberately. Mason took me to dinner without pretending we were only hungry at the same time. He introduced me to coworkers as the man he was seeing, spoke with people he trusted, and asked questions without expecting me to have every answer. Some evenings I stayed at the house. Others, he slept at the apartment. We learned the difference between domestic habit and intimacy chosen on purpose. We argued once about the house, then twice. Eventually, we sat with the realtor and discussed the options together. Mason decided not to sell that year, not because keeping it guaranteed our relationship, but because he wanted time to live there without treating every room as a goodbye. When my lease ended, I moved back. The final box was still sealed. Mason carried it upstairs and placed it in the center of the room, which we no longer called the spare room. Then he sat on the floor and waited. Inside were my father's books, old photographs, the chipped wooden bird I had carved as a child, and a small brass compass that no longer pointed north. I had kept them wrapped for so long that opening them felt like disturbing someone else's life. Mason picked up one framed photograph, but did not ask where it belonged. I carried it downstairs and placed it on the built-in shelves. One object at a time, I chose a place. That Sunday, we returned to the dining room wall. We did not paint over the old swatches. Beside quiet blue, we added a deep, warm green that neither of us would have chosen for buyers. Mason opened the sample can and read the label. Evergreen Home. That is an aggressively sentimental name. You chose it. I chose the color. Marketing chose the emotional manipulation. We painted the rectangle together. When it dried, Mason handed me the pencil. Beneath the color, I wrote our names and the date. For the first time in my life, staying wasn't something another person allowed me to do. It was something we chose together.